The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Marine Corporal Sarah Martinez adjusted her gear one final time. At 22 years old, she had already served 2 tours in Iraq, but nothing could have prepared her for what this day would bring. The intelligence reports had been clear. Insurgent activity in Sector 7 was at an all-time high, and civilian evacuations were desperately needed. Sarah's unit, Alpha Company, had been tasked with securing a 3-block radius while Navy SEALs conducted a high-priority extraction mission deeper in the city. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Establish a perimeter, maintain communication, and provide cover fire if needed. But in Fallujah, even the simplest missions could turn deadly in seconds. As the convoy rolled through the narrow streets, Sarah noticed the unusual silence. Windows were shuttered, doors were barred, and not a single person could be seen walking the normally busy marketplace. Her squad leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, spoke quietly into his radio, confirming their position with command. The absence of civilians was both a blessing and a warning. It meant fewer innocents in harm's way, but it also suggested that something big was about to happen. The convoy stopped at the designated checkpoint, a partially destroyed building that offered good visibility of the surrounding area. Sarah and her team quickly established defensive positions, with 2 Marines on the roof, 2 covering the rear entrance, and Sarah positioned at the main window facing the street where the SEALs would eventually emerge with their target. Through her scope, Sarah watched the empty streets with growing unease. Years of combat experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and every fiber of her being was screaming that they were walking into a trap. She keyed her radio to report her concerns, but before she could speak, the distinctive crack of sniper fire echoed through the air. The bullet struck the concrete wall just inches from her head, sending chips of debris flying. "Contact!" she shouted into her radio as chaos erupted around her. Within seconds, the quiet morning had transformed into a hellscape of automatic weapons fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and shouting voices in multiple languages. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She identified 3 muzzle flashes from buildings across the street and began returning precise controlled fire. Her M4 carbine bucked against her shoulder as she engaged targets, trying to keep the insurgents pinned down while her teammates maneuvered to better positions. The sound of breaking glass and splintering wood filled the air as enemy bullets tore through their makeshift shelter. Over the radio, frantic voices reported the situation. The SEALs were trapped 2 blocks away, unable to reach the extraction point due to heavy resistance. Multiple insurgent cells had apparently coordinated this attack, and Alpha Company was now the only thing standing between the trapped SEALs and complete disaster. Sarah felt the first bullet graze her left shoulder, tearing through her uniform and drawing blood. The burning sensation was immediate, but she ignored it, continuing to provide suppressing fire as Sergeant Rodriguez called for air support. The second bullet came minutes later, striking her right thigh and causing her to stumble. Pain shot through her leg, but she steadied herself against the window frame and kept fighting. The insurgents seemed to have an endless supply of ammunition and fighters. Every time Sarah thought she had cleared a building, new shooters would appear from different windows. Her squad was taking heavy casualties. Rodriguez was already down with a chest wound, and Private Johnson had been hit in the arm. Despite their desperate situation, Sarah knew they couldn't retreat. The SEALs were counting on them, and abandoning the position would mean certain death for the trapped operators. As the firefight intensified, Sarah realized that the insurgents were using a coordinated pincer movement, trying to flank their position from both sides while maintaining frontal pressure. She made a split-second decision that would define the rest of her life. Someone needed to move to the exposed southern window to prevent the flanking maneuver, even though it meant leaving cover and facing almost certain injury or death. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed extra ammunition and sprinted across the room, diving behind an overturned table just as a hail of bullets shattered the window above her. From this new position, she could see at least 15 insurgents moving through the alley, trying to circle around behind her squad. She opened fire immediately, her accurate shooting forcing them to take cover and buying precious time for her teammates. It was in this moment, pinned down in an exposed position with bullets flying all around her, that Sarah truly understood what courage meant. It wasn't the absence of fear, she was terrified. It was the decision to act despite that fear, to put the mission and her brothers in arms above her own safety. She would need every ounce of that courage for what was about to come. The third bullet found its mark as Sarah was reloading her weapon. It struck her left forearm, shattering bone and sending waves of agony up her arm. She gritted her teeth and switched to shooting with just her right hand, knowing that stopping now meant death for everyone in the building. Blood was beginning to pool beneath her, but her vision remained clear and her resolve unshaken. Through her earpiece, she could hear the desperate radio calls from the SEAL team. They were taking heavy casualties and running low on ammunition. Their extraction helicopter couldn't land due to the intense ground fire, and they were trapped in a building with multiple wounded operators. The estimated time until they would be overrun was less than 20 minutes. Sarah's squad was down to 4 effective fighters, and ammunition was running dangerously low. The insurgents seemed to sense their weakness and intensified their assault. Rocket-propelled grenades began impacting the building, sending concrete and steel flying through the air. One explosion was so close that it temporarily deafened Sarah and filled the room with choking dust. The fourth and fifth bullets came almost simultaneously. One struck her right shoulder, spinning her around and causing her to drop her rifle. The other grazed her neck, missing her carotid artery by millimeters. Sarah felt warm blood running down her chest, but she forced herself to pick up her weapon and continue fighting. Every movement was becoming more difficult, but she refused to let pain slow her down. Private Martinez, the youngest member of their squad, was crying as he tried to bandage Sergeant Rodriguez's wounds. Sarah could see the terror in his eyes. He was just 18 years old and had never experienced combat this intense. She called out to him over the gunfire, her voice steady despite her injuries. "Martinez, look at me. You're doing great, kid. Just keep your head down and keep shooting." Her words seemed to calm the young Marine, and he returned to his position with renewed determination. Sarah realized that her squad was looking to her for leadership now that Rodriguez was down. Despite being the most seriously wounded, she was the most experienced combat veteran remaining, and her calm demeanor under fire was keeping the others focused. The sixth bullet struck her left leg just below the knee. Sarah felt her leg buckle, and she had to use the wall to support herself. Blood was now flowing freely from multiple wounds, and she could feel herself growing weaker. But through the window she could see movement in the street. The insurgents were massing for what appeared to be a final assault on their position. Sarah keyed her radio with trembling fingers, trying to reach any friendly forces in the area. Any station, this is Alpha Company. We are taking heavy casualties and need immediate support. SEAL team is trapped 2 blocks north of our position. We cannot hold much longer." The response crackled through the static. "Alpha Company, this is Phantom 6. We're 15 minutes out with close air support. Hold your position at all costs." 15 minutes might as well have been 15 hours. Sarah looked around at her remaining squad members. Martinez was bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Corporal Peterson had been shot in the shoulder, and Private Williams was unconscious from a head injury. She was the only one still capable of effective resistance, and she was fading fast. The 7th and 8th bullets came from a sniper who had positioned himself in a minaret several blocks away. Both rounds struck Sarah in the chest, one deflecting off her body armor but the other finding a gap near her ribs. She felt a sharp burning pain and tasted blood in her mouth. Her breathing became labored, and she knew she had sustained serious internal injuries. But Sarah's resolve only grew stronger. She thought about her younger brother back home, who had just enlisted in the Marines and would soon be deployed to this same hellish place. She thought about the SEAL operators trapped nearby, fighting for their lives and depending on her to keep the escape route open. Most of all, she thought about the oath she had taken when she enlisted, to defend her country and protect her fellow service members. With tremendous effort, Sarah dragged herself to a new firing position where she could better observe the street. The insurgents were preparing for their assault, gathering weapons and ammunition in the building across from her. She began engaging targets with careful, precise shots, making every bullet count since ammunition was nearly exhausted. The 9th bullet struck her in the left side, just above her hip. Sarah gasped as pain radiated through her abdomen, but she forced herself to keep shooting. She could see at least 30 insurgents preparing to rush their building, and she knew that once they breached the ground floor, it would be over for everyone inside. Sarah made a decision that would save countless lives but nearly cost her own. She grabbed the last 2 grenades from her gear and prepared to make a desperate move. If she could reach the stairwell and hold it against the assault, she might buy enough time for air support to arrive, and for the SEALs to reach safety. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only chance any of them had. Sarah began her desperate move toward the stairwell, dragging her wounded leg behind her and leaving a trail of blood on the concrete floor. Every step was agony, but she could hear the insurgents shouting orders outside as they prepared to storm the building. The sound of boots on broken glass indicated they were already moving toward the ground floor entrance. The 10th bullet caught her in the back as she rounded the corner, the impact throwing her forward against the wall. She felt a sharp pain between her shoulder blades and knew the round had probably damaged her spine. Her legs began to feel numb, but her arms still functioned, and that was all she needed to complete her mission. Private Martinez saw what she was attempting and tried to follow her. "Corporal Martinez, I'm coming with you," he shouted over the gunfire. Sarah turned and looked at the young Marine with fierce determination. "Negative. Stay with Rodriguez and Peterson." "That's an order." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. Sarah reached the top of the stairwell just as the first insurgents breached the ground floor. She could hear them moving through the building below, calling out in Arabic as they searched for the American soldiers. Her hands shook as she pulled the pin from her first grenade, knowing that timing would be everything. The 11th bullet found her as she leaned around the corner to observe the insurgents' positions. It struck her in the right hip, sending fresh waves of pain through her already battered body. Sarah bit down hard on her tongue to keep from crying out, tasting blood as she fought to maintain consciousness. The metallic taste mixed with the dust and smoke that filled the air. Below her, Sarah could count at least 12 insurgents moving through the ground floor rooms. They were being methodical, checking each corner and preparing to advance up the stairs where her wounded squad members were hiding. She knew that once they reached the second floor, it would be a massacre. The young Marines under her protection had no chance against so many experienced fighters. Sarah pulled the pin from her first grenade and let the spoon fly. She counted to 3 and then rolled it down the stairwell, where it detonated among the advancing insurgents. The explosion was deafening in the confined space, and she could hear screams and shouting as several attackers were either killed or wounded. But more kept coming. Her grenade had only delayed the inevitable. The 12th bullet came from behind her, fired by an insurgent who had somehow reached the second floor through a window. The round struck her in the lower back, and Sarah felt her legs go completely numb. She realized with a sinking heart that her spine had been severed and she would never walk again. But her arms still worked, and she still had 1 grenade left. Sarah turned to face the insurgent who had shot her, raising her sidearm with tremendous effort. The man was young, probably no older than she was, and his eyes showed the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt. They stared at each other for a split second across the smoky hallway, 2 warriors caught in the madness of war. She fired 3 times, and the insurgent collapsed. But the gunfire had revealed her position to the others, and bullets began impacting the walls around her. Sarah dragged herself behind a partially collapsed beam, using her elbows to pull her paralyzed legs along the floor. Every movement left bloody smears on the concrete, but she refused to give up. Through her earpiece, she heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the roar of jet engines overhead. The air support had finally arrived, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of bombs falling toward insurgent positions outside the building. The cavalry was coming, but Sarah knew she had to hold out just a little longer. The 13th bullet struck her in the chest, just below her previous wound. Sarah felt blood filling her lungs, and her breathing became a wet, labored wheeze. She knew she was dying, but the SEALs were still trapped and her squad was still in danger. With enormous effort, she keyed her radio one final time. "Phantom 6, this is Corporal Martinez. Building is partially secure. Insurgents on ground floor. My squad is on second floor northeast corner. We have multiple wounded and need immediate extraction." Her voice was weak but clear, and she managed to provide precise coordinates for both her position and the trapped SEAL team. The response came immediately. "Martinez, we see your position. SEAL extraction team is moving to your location." "Hold on, Marine. Help is coming." Sarah smiled through her pain, knowing that she had succeeded in her mission. The trapped operators would be saved and her squad would survive. Sarah prepared her final grenade, pulling the pin and holding the spoon down with her weakening grip. If the insurgents reached the second floor, she would detonate it and take as many of them with her as possible. She thought about her family back home, about the flag-draped coffin that would soon carry her body, and about the young Marines whose lives she had saved through her sacrifice. The sound of helicopters grew louder as Sarah lay bleeding on the floor, her finger wrapped around the grenade spoon. Through the broken windows, she could see the distinctive shapes of military aircraft circling overhead, finally bringing the air support that could turn the tide of this desperate battle. But she also knew that time was running out, both for her and for everyone depending on her, to hold this position. The 14th and final bullet came from an insurgent who had crawled up through a hole blown in the floor by the earlier grenade explosion. The round struck Sarah in the stomach, and she felt a cold numbness spreading through her abdomen. Blood pooled beneath her, and her vision began to blur around the edges. She knew that this wound would be the one that finally claimed her life. But even as her body failed her, Sarah's mind remained sharp and focused. She could hear the insurgents regrouping below, preparing for one final assault on the second floor where her wounded squad members lay helpless. The air support overhead was engaging targets throughout the city, but the building where she lay was too close to friendly forces for effective bombing. Through her fading vision, Sarah saw a figure appear at the top of the stairs. It was an insurgent fighter, his AK-47 raised and ready to fire. Behind him, she could see others preparing to follow. This was the moment she had been preparing for, her final act as a United States Marine. With the last of her strength, Sarah released the grenade spoon and held the explosive device against her chest. "For the Corps," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. The insurgent raised his weapon, but he was too late. Sarah had already made her choice, and nothing could stop what was about to happen. But in that final moment, as her finger tightened on the grenade and death seemed certain, the building suddenly shook with the sound of heavy boots on the stairs. The insurgent who had been about to shoot her spun around in surprise, and Sarah heard the distinctive sound of suppressed gunfire that could only mean one thing: the SEALs had arrived. The Navy SEAL team moved through the building like ghosts, their advanced training and superior equipment allowing them to neutralize the insurgent threat with deadly efficiency. Sarah watched through dimming eyes as the operators cleared each room, their movements precise and coordinated. These were the men she had been fighting to save, and now they had come to save her. The first SEAL to reach Sarah was a massive man with kind eyes who immediately knelt beside her and began assessing her wounds. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, seeing the extent of her injuries. "Corpsman! Get up here now." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to giving orders in life or death situations. Sarah tried to speak, but only blood came from her mouth. The SEAL gently placed his hand on her shoulder and looked directly into her eyes. "Easy, Marine. You did good. You saved a lot of lives today. We're going to get you out of here." His voice was calm and reassuring, but Sarah could see the concern in his expression. The Navy corpsman who arrived was a young man with expert hands who immediately began working to stabilize Sarah's most critical wounds. He started multiple IV lines, administered pain medication, and called for an urgent medical evacuation. "We need a bird now," he shouted into his radio. "Female Marine, multiple GSWs, critical condition. She's losing a lot of blood." As the medical team worked on her, Sarah could hear the SEALs coordinating with her surviving squad members. Private Martinez was crying with relief as he reported their status to the team leader. Sergeant Rodriguez, despite his own wounds, managed to give a complete situation report that would help the SEALs understand what had happened during the battle. The SEAL team leader, a man with silver hair and steady hands, knelt beside Sarah as the corpsman continued his work. "Corporal Martinez, I'm Lieutenant Commander Stevens. My team was trapped 2 blocks from here, and we would all be dead if not for you and your Marines. You held that position against impossible odds." Sarah tried to respond, but her voice was too weak. Stevens seemed to understand anyway. "Your squad told me what you did, how you moved to an exposed position to prevent the flanking maneuver, how you held the stairwell against overwhelming numbers. That kind of courage is rare, even among special operations forces." The sound of rotor blades grew louder as the medical evacuation helicopter approached the building. The SEALs had managed to secure a landing zone in a nearby courtyard, clearing away insurgent fighters and marking the location with smoke grenades. Sarah knew that her ordeal was finally coming to an end. As the medical team prepared to move her to the helicopter, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace washing over her. She had done her duty, saved her squad, and helped rescue the trapped SEAL team. Whatever happened next, she could face it knowing that she had lived up to the highest traditions of the Marine Corps. The last thing Sarah remembered before losing consciousness was the gentle vibration of the helicopter as it lifted off from Fallujah, carrying her toward the safety of a field hospital where skilled surgeons would fight to save her life. She had been wounded 14 times, but she had refused to fall until help arrived. Sarah woke up 3 days later in a military hospital in Germany, surrounded by the steady beeping of medical equipment and the quiet sounds of nurses moving through the ward. Her body was wrapped in bandages, and she could feel the weight of casts on both her legs. The first thing she noticed was that she couldn't feel anything below her waist. The damage to her spine had been severe. A doctor with gentle eyes and graying hair sat beside her bed, reviewing her chart. When he saw that she was awake, he smiled and leaned forward. "Welcome back, Corporal Martinez. I'm Dr. Harrison. You've been unconscious for several days while we work to stabilize your condition. How are you feeling?" Sarah tried to speak, but her throat was dry and painful from the breathing tube that had recently been removed. Dr. Harrison offered her a small cup of ice chips, which felt wonderful against her parched lips. After a few moments, she managed to whisper, "My squad."
"Are they okay?"
Dr. Harrison's expression softened. "Your squad members are alive because of what you did. Private Martinez and Corporal Peterson are recovering from their wounds and should make full recoveries. Sergeant Rodriguez required surgery, but he's stable and expected to return to duty. They've all been asking about you constantly." The relief Sarah felt was overwhelming. Despite her own injuries, knowing that her Marines had survived made all the pain worthwhile. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude, thanking God that she had been able to protect the young men who had been placed under her care. Over the following days, Sarah learned the full extent of her injuries from Dr. Harrison and the medical team. She had sustained 14 separate gunshot wounds, lost nearly half her blood volume, and suffered severe damage to her spinal cord that would likely leave her permanently paralyzed from the waist down. Multiple surgeries had been required to repair damage to her organs, and she would face months of rehabilitation. But the most difficult news came when Dr. Harrison explained that her military career was over. The extent of her injuries meant that she would be medically discharged from the Marine Corps, ending the career that had given her life meaning and purpose. Sarah had always defined herself as a Marine, and the thought of losing that identity was almost as painful as her physical wounds. Lieutenant Commander Stevens, the SEAL team leader whose unit Sarah had helped rescue, visited her on her 5th day in the hospital. He brought with him letters from every member of his team, expressing their gratitude for her actions in Fallujah. "Corporal, I've been in special operations for 15 years, and I've never seen courage like what you displayed that day," he said quietly. Stevens also brought news that Sarah's actions were being reviewed for the highest possible military decorations. The entire chain of command, from her company commander all the way up to the Pentagon, had taken notice of what she had accomplished. Her story was already spreading throughout the military community, inspiring other service members with its example of selfless heroism. Private Martinez visited Sarah every day, often bringing drawings and letters from schoolchildren back home who had heard about her story. The young Marine had been deeply affected by what he had witnessed in Fallujah, but he credited Sarah with teaching him what it truly meant to be a Marine. "You saved my life, Corporal. Not just that day, but you showed me who I want to be," he told her. The hardest visitor was Sarah's mother, who flew to Germany as soon as she learned about her daughter's condition. Maria Martinez was a strong woman who had raised 3 children as a single mother, but seeing her daughter so badly injured broke her heart. She sat beside Sarah's bed for hours, holding her hand and telling her how proud she was. "Mija, you don't know how many people you've inspired," her mother said through tears. "The whole town is talking about what you did. They're planning a parade for when you come home. You're a hero." But Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a broken soldier whose fighting days were over. The psychological adjustment was perhaps more difficult than the physical recovery. Sarah had always been fiercely independent, and the thought of being confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life was devastating. She went through periods of deep depression, questioning whether her sacrifice had been worth it, and wondering what kind of life she could have as a disabled veteran. But gradually, with the help of military psychologists and the support of her fellow Marines, Sarah began to find a new sense of purpose. She realized that her story could inspire others, both military and civilian, to find courage in their own difficult circumstances. Her example showed that heroism wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting with courage despite fear. Dr. Harrison explained that Sarah's recovery would be a long process requiring multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. She would need to learn how to navigate the world from a wheelchair, develop new skills for independent living, and find ways to cope with chronic pain from her injuries. It would be the hardest fight of her life, but she was determined to win it. As Sarah looked out the hospital window at the German countryside, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not let her injuries defeat her. She would recover, rebuild, and find new ways to serve her country and her fellow veterans. The war had taken her legs, but it had not taken her spirit. 2 years after that terrible day in Fallujah, Sarah sat in her wheelchair at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, addressing a room full of wounded warriors who were beginning their own journeys of recovery. She had traveled a long and difficult path from that blood-soaked building in Iraq to this moment, and every challenge had made her stronger. The medal ceremony had taken place 6 months earlier, attended by the highest levels of military leadership and Sarah's proud family. She had been awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat, making her one of only a handful of women to receive such recognition. The citation had read in part, "For extraordinary heroism while serving with Alpha Company during combat operations in Fallujah, Iraq. Corporal Martinez's exceptional courage under fire and selfless dedication to her fellow Marines saved numerous lives and exemplified the finest traditions of the United States Marine Corps." But for Sarah, the real meaning of her experience came not from the medals or recognition, but from the lives she had been able to touch since her recovery. She had become a powerful advocate for wounded veterans, working with Congress to improve health care and benefits for disabled service members. Her testimony before congressional committees had helped secure millions of dollars in additional funding for veteran programs. The young Marines she spoke to at Walter Reed saw in her a living example that wounds, both visible and invisible, did not have to define a person's future. Sarah shared her story honestly, including the dark periods of depression and self-doubt that had nearly defeated her after her injuries. She wanted them to know that healing was possible, but it required the same kind of courage they had shown in combat. "When I was lying in that hospital bed in Germany, I thought my life was over," Sarah told the assembled Marines. "I couldn't imagine a future where I mattered, where I could still make a difference. But I learned that serving others doesn't require perfect legs or perfect health. It requires a perfect heart." Private Martinez, now Sergeant Martinez, had remained close to Sarah throughout her recovery. He had extended his service and was currently training new Marines at Paris Island, using lessons he had learned from Sarah to teach recruits about courage and leadership. He often brought his trainees to hear Sarah speak, knowing that her example was more powerful than any lecture he could give. Lieutenant Commander Stevens had also maintained contact with Sarah, and his SEAL team had adopted her as an honorary member. They regularly visited wounded warriors at military hospitals, sharing Sarah's story and demonstrating the bonds that connected all service members regardless of branch. Stevens often said that Sarah had taught his elite operators new lessons about what it meant to never leave a fallen comrade behind. Sarah's personal life had also found new meaning and happiness. She had met David, a fellow veteran who had lost his sight in Afghanistan, at a rehabilitation center. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on mutual understanding of the challenges faced by disabled veterans. They had married in a simple ceremony attended by Marines and SEALs from around the world, and David had become Sarah's partner in her advocacy work. The couple had started a nonprofit organization called Wounded, but Not Broken, which provided support and resources to recently injured veterans and their families. The organization arranged hospital visits, provided financial assistance for medical expenses not covered by military benefits, and created peer support networks connecting wounded veterans with others who had faced similar challenges. Sarah had also returned to school, earning a degree in social work with a specialization in veteran affairs. Her professors and classmates were initially intimidated by her military background and combat decorations, but they quickly learned that Sarah's wisdom came not from her medals, but from her compassionate understanding of human suffering and resilience. The nightmares still came sometimes, replaying those terrible moments in Fallujah when death had seemed certain. Sarah had learned to manage her post-traumatic stress through therapy, medication, and the support of other veterans who understood her experiences. She was open about her struggles with mental health, believing that removing the stigma around psychological wounds was just as important as treating physical injuries. On quiet evenings, Sarah would often sit on her porch with David, watching the sunset and reflecting on the unexpected path her life had taken. She sometimes wondered what would have happened if she had chosen differently that day in Fallujah, if she had stayed in cover instead of moving to defend the stairwell. But she always concluded that she would make the same choice again. The letters from the families of the SEALs she had helped save were among her most treasured possessions. Children who might have grown up without fathers had instead been able to celebrate birthdays, graduations, and weddings because of the sacrifice made by a young Marine who refused to abandon her post. That knowledge made every painful day of recovery worthwhile. As Sarah looked toward the future, she saw endless possibilities for service and purpose. Her story had become a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of selfless sacrifice. She had been wounded 14 times in Fallujah, but she had refused to fall until help arrived. In saving others, she had ultimately saved herself, discovering that true heroism lay not in avoiding wounds but in healing them, both her own and those of others who needed her strength to carry on.